The term best for business is all but synonymous with the McMahon family when it comes to professional wrestling, which makes it all the more curious to think that perhaps Vince McMahon himself isn't best for business. While Vince McMahon does have the reputation of being the shrewd businessman that does everything with the bottom line in mind, it could very well be possible that he isn't quite the cunning financial expert that a lot of us think that he is. But at the same time, this might also mean that he's more one of the boys than any insider or old-timer wants to admit. Either way, this is a conversation that serves as the topic of this episode, because today, CM Punk once famously said that Vince McMahon is a millionaire that should be a billionaire. And wouldn't you know, in the time since CM Punk said that, Vince McMahon has become exactly that. Getting $1 billion from Saudi Arabia, getting $1 billion from the Peacock, and getting $9.5 billion for selling WWE to Endeavor. And in the time since doing so, some of Endeavor's financial decisions seem to have bore better fruit than some of the choices that Vince McMahon would have made in the same position. And I'm not just talking about the content being better, although it is. So what exactly am I talking about? Well, let's get into it. Baron Corbin was recently released by WWE after 12 long years in the company. And he's not the only one, as Dolph Ziggler, another veteran of World Wrestling Entertainment, also finds himself not in WWE. But despite various levels of, well, technical prowess and mic skills, both of them don't really seem to have all that much in common. Except, of course, for their perceived financial value to a major billion-dollar company. Even though Vince did eventually become a billionaire, we should still keep in mind the whole principle behind what CM Punk said. And it's that Vince should be making more money, but isn't, because he surrounds himself by glad-handing yes man. And no, I'm not trying to say that Dolph Ziggler or Baron Corbin is necessarily that. They might be, I don't know. I've never met them. What I'm trying to get at here is that the company Vince keeps in his company may not be the most financially responsible. In the case of the show-off, now look, I am a big Dolph Ziggler fan, but he was one of the higher paid employees for WWE and he was barely kept on television. And after being there for so long and not being used all that much, well, it's pretty obvious to any major corporation that it costs more than he's bringing in. And yes, you could easily make the argument that you could just use Dolph Ziggler more and he might be able to bring in more revenue than he costs. However, that's not the point. The point of the matter is, while Vince McMahon was perfectly okay with keeping a guy on his payroll, despite not using him, a big company is not going to do the same thing. When it comes to most companies, the biggest cost is almost always labor, paying your employees, which unfortunately means it's also the biggest pull to draw from whenever you're looking to cut some costs. Patreon shout out to Dakari Garmin, who's so super he calls TBS just the regular station. Mr. J, who Ted DiBiase has to borrow money from. Ron Hawthorne, who single-handedly could have saved WCW's Millionaires Club. Manji Stray, whose franchise is so big it's about to be managed by Francine. And Rebel X himself, the rated R superstar Harry Flynn and the Harry Flynn Show. And also a big thank you to all of my Patreons. You are what keeps this channel going. Moving on, let's look at Baron Corbin. While there are fans of his somewhere, I assume, there really aren't that many. Baron Corbin, just quite frankly, is not a draw. And after being in the company for over a decade, something that not even Hulk Hogan did in any one single run, why keep him around? What is his overall value? What does he bring to your company that you wouldn't have without him? And if it's nothing, well, then again, he's just costing you money. He's just a paycheck going right out the door without any return on your investment. Now, it has been said that allegedly, backstage, Baron Corbin is very easy to work with and the writers liked working with him. And that might be great, but can I spend that? What money does that bring in? And that right there is the exact kind of mindset that major billion-dollar corporations have that, well, quite frankly, wrestling promoters don't. While we're on the subject of wrestlers we really haven't seen ever since WWE merged with the UFC, I do feel the need to point out a very specific crop of wrestlers, and it's those who were in UFC, surprisingly enough. Brock Lesnar, Ronda Rousey, Matt Riddle all haven't been seen on WWE TV in quite some time, and in the cases of Rousey and Riddle, they're not even in the company anymore. And this all happened after they were acquired by Endeavor. Now sure, I did just talk about how a major corporation won't make it personal, but instead, they will just look at business. But yet, all three of these wrestlers have a history with UFC, and not all of them have a good one at that. As Matt Riddle was ultimately fired from Ultimate Fighting, Brock Lesnar was suspended and fined for having an undisclosed banned substance in his system, which was followed by Brock retiring from the sport. And as for Ronda Rousey, well, she seems to be in good standing with the UFC, having been inducted into their Hall of Fame back in 2018. However, it's still curious to see that so many former UFC employees are no longer in WWE now that they have merged with Ultimate Fighting under the TKO banner. However, at the same time, while I don't think business should be personal, I'm not necessarily sure that any of these choices are. Now, in the case of Brock Lesnar and Matt Riddle, they both have their public baggage, if you will, and so Endeavor distancing themselves from the two of them, well, that does make some financial sense. But I'm not entirely convinced of that, as there are plenty of wrestlers out there who have had bad things happen to their reputation, but still found themselves highlighted on WWE television simply because they were a major draw. And that just goes to what I've been saying for years about Rousey and Lesnar. I have talked repeatedly about how both of them are not worth their major price tag. Brock Lesnar is often the highest paid employee in WWE, and Ronda Rousey is often the highest paid woman in WWE. And is that remotely fair? Do they bring that revenue back? Absolutely not. I've proven it over and over again. And yes, in that case, it would be very illogical to have your highest paid employee not featured on your program at all. So with Brock, who knows? Maybe it is business, maybe it is personal. I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see. And that just goes to show you never can tell with Brock Lesnar.
See, it's not an ad. It's sponsorship.
It's distasteful.
It's free money.
There are plenty of things we could do to make a quick buck.
Now, when it comes to making $1 billion, it's not about making friends, but it's more than just the people in your employ, as there are other things that happened in WWE that Vince McMahon seemed to have been primarily against, and Prime is just the thing I'm talking about, as in the Prime logo that's been featured in WWE rings, and the Prime props that have been next to the commentary table. Despite the controversy, Logan Paul's energy drink is still a major sponsor of WWE, getting advertised right in the center of the mat, as well as ringside right by the announcers. And as we saw in Survivor Series, it's only gone worse with True Classic and Sonic 3 getting in on the game. Now, while Vince McMahon is no enemy to the idea of sponsorship, featuring logos everywhere from around the ring, to even having specialty matches, for whatever reason, he never crossed the line and had a logo right in the middle of the ring. But it's there now. So it would seem that this is just one more thing that Vince McMahon never did that Endeavor is totally willing to do. And it's not just the canvas either, as there are other things too, such as the Professional Sports Wrestling Championship belts, and cost-cutting measures that Vince McMahon used to do but hadn't done in a really long time, such as having Raw only be 2 hours, as well as taping every other episode. Now sure, maybe if Vince McMahon was still in the company, he might have arrived on some of these decisions as well. But the point of the matter is, UFC has always been a much bigger presence than WWE. They were worth more as a company, they had better pay-per-view buys, and they generally draw a better attendance on average. But even though the UFC is a newer company and MMA is a newer concept than professional wrestling, somehow they beat Vince McMahon to the punch, topping him on almost every level. And so, now that Endeavor has gotten WWE, is it any surprise that they're going to do everything in their power to try to raise the premier wrestling promotion up to the same level as their other combat sport league? I'm sure that all of these are just the beginning of many changes that we're going to see in World Wrestling Entertainment. Some good and some bad. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form advocating for this greed-based mentality, and I don't think that super mega corporations are necessarily best for society, because in many ways, they're not. I'm just trying to highlight some of the small differences with that kind of mindset versus that of a traditional wrestling promoter, even one as rich as Vince McMahon. Because despite all he accomplished, and despite everything that WWE has become, pro wrestling being a global franchise is still a relatively new concept. Even the idea of it going national isn't all that old. Oftentimes, when experts talk about WWE versus AEW, they're very quick to point out that as good as AEW might be doing, they're nowhere close on a financial level or a recognition level to being what WWE is. However, as much of a global phenomenon as World Wrestling Entertainment may be itself, when we look at other major corporations and other billionaires, Vince McMahon, WWE aren't in the same category whatsoever. Not saying that WWE isn't a huge company, because of course it is, but I'm just trying to point out its place in the pantheon when we compare it to other sports companies, such as the NFL, the NBA, or the UFC, to mention other major brands that aren't even related to sports. Connecticut may be a long way away from North Carolina, and modern WWE is a long way away from the territory days, but perhaps Vince and the WWE haven't grown out of it as much as we think he has. Because as crazy as it might seem, and as much as Vince McMahon is definitely the guy who brought professional wrestling into the mainstream, earning more money than anyone had ever done with it before, there's a shot that he still might have been shortchanging the business. And all of his personal wheelings and dealings and mindset of playing favorites might just make him more of one of the old school promoters than a lot of people care to admit. Alright, there you go. Some of the biggest differences between Vince McMahon and Endeavor when it comes to business practices. But what are some others that you could think of? Let me know down in the comments. And also, do you prefer these changes, or do you think Vince McMahon had the right idea? Let me know, and also make sure that you're subscribed right here to the Thinking Fans channel, and that you also give this video a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all my amazing Patreons out there, and as always, Dave knows